third and final speaker today is Christopher Bartel, Professor of Philosophy at Appalachian State University. Professor Bartel works on topics in aesthetics and ethics and the intersection between them, thinking especially about video games, maybe tabletop role-playing games, music, technology and media ethics and things of that sort. His talk today is entitled Augmented Reality and Fictional Wrongs, Lessons from Video Games. So, Christopher, please take it away.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you again for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I have to begin with an apology that I have a feeling that a lot of my talk is probably going to fall into many of the traps that were set by Chris Mills. Particularly it depends on how you use the technology trap. I'm completely guilty of that one, but we'll see how it goes. Most of my work has been in aesthetics, but I also work in technology stuff. The main thing that I am interested in technology is the way that we interact with human analogs, whether the human analog is a robot, or whether it's a chatbot, or whether it's a video game character, or whether it's an AR representation of a human. I'm interested in the way that the user particularly interacts with human analogs. Some of what I have to say will have something to do with designers as well, but my focus tends to be on what the user is doing. And I'm going to begin my talk by making a couple of claims that I have no intention of defending. Well, I'll start off bold. And I hope this kind of gives an indication of why I'm interested in these issues. Broadly speaking, I think the interesting thing about human analogs is that people, when it comes to digital technologies, conflate fiction with digital technologies too often or too easily. So one undefended claim is that I think a lot of people conflate digital objects with fictional entities, often inappropriately. Sometimes it might be appropriate, but sometimes I think it really isn't. And to think of dumb examples, like think of all the awful things that people will do online. People who will not shoplift in their real lives will happily pirate down. They'll download pirated software. Internet trolls would never say out loud some of the things that they post online. In virtual reality, sexual assault in the form of groping is extremely common. And I'm sure that there are lots of explanations for why these things happen, particularly online. It has to do with the anonymity of the internet. It's also so incredibly easy to get away to actually think of downloading pirated software. It's so easy to do. It just feels like it's what the internet was designed for. So I'm sure that there are many explanations for why people do awful things online that they would never do in real life. But one of the interesting features of that, for me, is that many people who commit these acts online don't even see their acts as problems. They don't see them as morally questionable, or they don't see themselves as people who have done wrong. It's that feature about the way that people think about the morality of their own actions. I don't think that can be explained away by saying, well, it has something to do with the anonymity of the internet, or it has something to do with the ease of action. So my second undefended claim is that I think what's happening here is lots of people fail to see their actions as problems because there is this incoherent tacit belief in the fictionality of what they're doing. So of my two undefended claims, the first one is about objects, the second one is about actions. And here's where I think it matters for us. If this is right, then those of us who care about technology ethics in its many different forms, we have to have some story to tell about fiction. We have to have some story to tell about what happens when somebody does a fictional wrong. So what kind of story can we tell? I think broadly speaking, you might have two kind of strategies that you could take. Sometimes these are in conflict with each other, and sometimes they actually dovetail together nicely. You could deny that what's happening is fictional. You could argue that what's happening is in fact real in some sense, whether it's online, whether it's VR, or whether it's AR. And because it's real in some sense, our actions are therefore open to real world moral evaluations. That strategy is popular because it preserves the moral, it preserves that intuition that fiction is supposed to be a moral free zone, that what happens in fiction is supposed to be pretend, and because it's pretend, I can't really get too morally upset about things. So it's the intuition that really only non-fictional actions are morally condemnable. The other strategy is you could be a robust fictionalist. You accept that what's happening is genuinely fiction in some sense, and yet then you still have to tell an interesting story about how these fictional actions are still open to moral evaluation. What both of these two views agree on is that some actions, online, VR or AR, are morally problematic, but what they disagree on is the nature of those actions and therefore also in the explanation of their wrongness. And you could contrast these two views with what you could call a, just a straightforward amoralist. The amoralist thinks that our actions are fictional and therefore morality is we don't have to take morality too seriously here. I'm going to discuss both of these accounts. My aim here isn't really to choose between them. I'm not trying to defend the one theory to rule them all. What I'm more interested in is looking at how different moral considerations might come about and what we could bring to bear when we criticize, when we think about these issues. So the main case that I want to talk about today, which I know from your past talks, you've talked quite a lot about the use of AR to occlude the external world and represent the external world the way that I want to see it. So my question is, what are the moral limits on that? Thinking of Jeff's taxonomy, if you have shared AR and partially shared AR and then personal AR, let's make this a hard one. Let's talk about personal AR. So if I'm walking around with my personal AR headset and this is impacting nobody else at all, what are the moral limits on how I can use my headset to represent the external world? I'm sure that there would be loads of really fun applications of this. Imagine we create a program that makes the entire world look like a Richard Scarry illustration. So I'm walking around in a children's book. That would be lovely. This is the world that I was promised as a child anyways. That'd be fantastic. Or, another great application is, a synesthesia application. When I listen to music, colored lights appear and it evolves along with the sound of the music. Future music concerts wouldn't have lighting engineers, they would have synesthesia engineers, that would be cool. We could play another great application would be people who suffer epileptic seizures. Your AR headset could minimize strobe lighting effects or, things that trigger epileptic seizures. That would be fantastic. We could play really fun games with this. We could play a game of zombie apocalypse tag, where some people in your AR are represented as zombies, and when they tag you, you become a zombie. That would be a totally fun game. But of course, we can also imagine really hellish applications of this as well. You could imagine the racist use of this technology to just whitewash the world or to make certain groups of people look like, inhuman animalistic monsters or something. That would be really awful. Here's the example that I want to focus on my talk on today. This example is perhaps absurd, but I totally believe that this would be created. So imagine an AR program that incorporates deep fake pornography so that everybody in my virtual field looks naked to me. Fantastic. Now I can oogle everybody in the world. It's basically, we've created AR X-ray specs. Teenage boys have been waiting for this technology for decades. It's almost here. In that, it would be nice if this couldn't happen. It would be nice if the technology was made in such a way that you couldn't have, AR X-ray specs. I don't believe that it will be. I'm cynical enough that I do think that something like this will be made. It would be great if there were like consent controls so that how I appear to you in your AR is something I have to consent to, but I don't think that's going to happen. Either they won't be made or they won't be robust, or there will be a plucky band of libertarian computer scientists in Silicon Valley who will create products that work around the consent controls and they will market it as augmented reality with freedom. And there will be a market for that, and it will definitely sell. But what I'm interested in is how would somebody defend this program? Because I, cynically expect that something like this would be made. I bet what they would say is, well, it's not real. It's just pixels on a screen, and nobody's actually being harmed. Both of these arguments are currently offered in video game studies often. Like, these 2 points come up in video game studies quite a bit. Looking at the second one, no one is actually harmed. What people typically have in mind here is when somebody offers this as a defense, they typically don't have in mind harm to themselves. What they typically have in mind is, I'm using this program and I'm having loads of fun. If my use of the program isn't harming other people in some material way, then, in a straightforward million liberal way, you have no right to criticize me having my fun if it has no impact on you. The first point also comes up really often in video game debates. At least in some cases, this seems entirely plausible. The AR applications that I described, like a synesthesia application or the Richard Scarry world application, these are all fictional, right? They're representing at least properties that objects in the world don't really have. The interesting thing about AR is the way that the representations that I'm seeing on my screen are triggered by things out in the external world, and the way that the representations on my screen are tracking changes in the external world. So there's a tight connection between these things, but there's still ultimately many of the properties represented, I could imagine one arguing, are fictional properties, right? So if you take these 2 points seriously, it's not real, it's just pixels on a screen and nobody is actually harmed, then what can we say, right? One of the questions that motivated a lot of my past research was, is it ever morally wrong to enjoy a fictional representation when it's just pixels on a screen and nobody is really harmed by it? When people talk about this in the case of video games, so brief diversion to video games for a minute. When people talk about this in the case of video games, there are standard cases that people raise. The kinds of video games that people get worried about tend to be things like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption or Call of Duty. And I understand why. Like, these are games that are fairly graphic, they're fairly gruesome, lots of violent things happen. One of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about games like these, particularly open world games, is that they give the player a certain degree of freedom so that you can choose what you're doing in the world without coercion. Like, in many video games, I have to commit an act of violence because that's just what it takes to play the game. Like, to a certain degree, I'm kind of coerced into performing this act of violence. But in open world games like Grand Theft Auto, I can just go on a killing spree for fun, and I do that of my own volition. And it's the voluntary aspect of it that I find really quite interesting. But here's the main point that I want to press. The defense that it's just pixels, right? It's just pixels on a screen. We shouldn't get so worried about it because it's not real. That's actually a really strong claim, right? If you believe that it's just pixels on a screen, that defense opens up the possibility of a whole host of really dark, miserable video games. I can give you real world examples of really dark, miserable video games. I won't give you images of these because you don't need any of this in your head. It's really awful. There are a whole bunch of white supremacist video games. There's a game called Ethnic Cleansing, where your job is to massacre as many non-white people as you can. There's another video game called Jesus Strikes Back, where you play as a Christian nationalist. You can actually play as the avatar of Jesus, and your job is to execute as many liberals and feminists and transgender people as you can. It's a really wild game. There are sexual assault video games. Battle Raper is it's like a Mortal Kombat game where it's like fisticuffs, right? Sort of like Mortal Kombat, but when your avatar punches a female character, her clothes fall off. And after you beat her, you have the option to rape her. That's a real game, really exists. There's some pretty dark stuff out there. And the defense tends to be, it's just pixels on a screen. But that defense strikes me as incredibly shallow when you get to white supremacist video games or, sexual assault video games or something like that. So if this claim is true, it's just pixels on a screen. Honestly, Grand Theft Auto is the least of your worries. There's a lot more to worry about than Grand Theft Auto. So what about my silly case of X-ray specs? How would that case play out? What could we say about that case? I think there's two ways that you could, we'll consider both the digital realist view and the robust fictionalist view. I think what a digital realist would have to say about this is that they would have to deny that the representations that you're seeing on your personal AR are fiction in some robust sense. I think what this person would have to say is that the problem with X-ray specs is that the naked individuals are not randomly generated fictional people. They're not NPCs. They're representations of actual people that I really encounter, even if the represented features of them are inaccurate, right? At least what X-ray specs is supposed to do is it's supposed to allow you to see that actual person as if they were actually naked. So what's happening here is the digital realist could say, this isn't fiction at all. What you're doing is objectifying and humiliating a specific individual. And we owe duties of respect to individuals in a straightforwardly, deontological sense. So by representing a person in a way that would contradict their wishes, we are, disrespecting their autonomy. In video game debates on this, I'm taking this point from John Tilson at Liverpool Hope University, who's given this argument almost exactly as I put it. He has an argument about, imagine that you're playing a video game that represents actual people that you really know, and you can commit all sorts of vile acts to these people in the game, even though technically that person is not really harmed and it's just pixels on a screen. That seems like they are in a way really harmed. What's harmed is they're disrespected, or they're Tilson puts it as a matter of disrespecting their autonomy. So I think what the digital realist would say is, because of the close relationship between real individuals and their AR representations in something like X-ray specs, fiction isn't really the right category here. There's something else going on that leads to the deontological worries, and that leads to that sort of, it opens up the door to that sort of moral assessment. So that's one view. I just realized I talk fast, so my talk is going to be a lot less than 35 minutes, but that's okay. We'll have time to chat. The other view to consider would be, what would the robust fictionalist have to say? For the robust fictionalist, the problem with X-ray specs has nothing to do with its status as a representation, fictional or otherwise. Think again of the video game case. In the case of video games, it doesn't really matter whether the game represents an actual person or characteristics of an actual social group. What matters instead is that the representations allow users to manifest attitudes towards those representations, which themselves, those attitudes, might be born of vicious character traits. So here's one example. Suppose I have a photograph of my grandfather, right? It's just a glossy piece of paper, right? It's like pixels on a screen. It's just a glossy piece of paper. Suppose I burn the photo of my grandfather. You could ask me, why did I do that? And I might give you, suppose, different answers I gave you. Suppose I told you that the reason why is because everybody in my family, I'm trying to downsize my stuff. Everybody in my family has these photos. We don't need so many duplicates. So I build a bonfire and I get rid of my old photos. That seems harmless. It seems unnecessary, but it seems harmless, like morally speaking. But suppose I gave you another story. Suppose I hold some vicious resentment toward my grandfather. So my burning of the photograph is not just a burning of a glossy piece of paper. It's something else. It's something like a symbolic performance of my resentment to my grandfather. What if it wasn't a photograph of my grandfather? What if it was a photograph of somebody else? What if it was an image of Martin Luther King Jr.? Or what if it was a photograph of the Pope? My burning of that seems like it's more than just getting rid of a glossy piece of paper. It seems like I'm doing something else. If you don't believe me, here's an experiment we could try. If you do think, well, pieces of paper are just pieces of paper, it doesn't really matter how you treat them. You don't have moral obligations to pieces of paper, whether they have pictures of people on them or not. Okay, try this experiment at home. The experiment comes in two parts. Part one, take a photograph of somebody that you love and stab the eyes out. If you can do that, then you can move on to part two. Part two, take the photograph with the stabbed out eyes and leave it in a place where your loved one will find it. When that happens, then give your loved one a lecture on the metaphysical status of photographs and let me know how that goes. That should be fun. So sometimes things are just pixels on a screen, but sometimes they're effigies in an interesting kind of way. What they are symbolic representations that we symbolically manifest certain attitudes towards. And the attitudes that I manifest towards these things can themselves be open to moral scrutiny. You can ask whether my vicious resentment to my grandfather, is that justified or am I being vindictive? My burning of a photograph of the Pope, what does that mean, right? Am I really just burning pieces of paper for fun? Or does it mean something? Does it have some relevance or some resonance for me? I can give you examples of this that has happened in video games as well. I like to think of these things as sometimes they function as effigies for people. And this is where I fall into one of Chris Mills's traps, because it kind of depends on how you use the technology. It depends on a psychological feature about the user. It's not really about the metaphysics of the way the thing was made. It doesn't really have anything to do with the status of the photograph. It really has to do with this psychological feature in the user's mind, that they have a use for the thing that becomes problematic, that it functions for them as an effigy. So in the game Red Dead Redemption, Red Dead Redemption is a video game where it's set in the Wild West of the United States in the 1890s. And you're running around the Wild West doing Wild West things. You play as a criminal, you join a gang, you rob banks, you do all sorts of stuff. In the online version of Red Dead Redemption 2, there's one city that you go to where you encounter a suffragette, a woman who's campaigning. This is the 1890s, so she's campaigning for women's votes. There are a whole bunch of gamers, there are a whole bunch of angry bro gamers who film themselves beating her up, and they post their images, their videos online. And what I'm saying is that for those players, this is not just a game. It's not pixels on a screen. It's an effigy. It means something to their actions, mean something. It manifests an attitude, and we can criticize whether that attitude is good or bad, right or wrong, whatever. You can actually imagine this going in two different ways. You can imagine, one player, the angry misogynist player who goes into Red Dead Redemption to beat up the suffragette, is treating the suffragette, who is an NPC, right? It's just pixels on a screen, but they're treating the suffragette as an effigy. You can imagine other players that hear about this and go to her defense, because it's online, right? It's an MMO game, so lots of people can participate. So you can imagine a whole bunch of feminist gamers that defend the suffragette. What's interesting is they too are treating this NPC, this mere computer code, as an effigy as well, but they're motivated by a very different set of attitudes. Then there are other people who are agnostic about the suffragette. They don't engage with it at all. To that person, they're probably not treating it as an effigy. It's just another NPC in the game. That's kind of one of the things that I think is interesting about these sort of technologies is that they give us the chance to interact with things and manifest aspects of ourselves in things like game worlds or in VR or in AR as well. So for the robust fictionalist, they would have to say the problem with X-ray specs is that it corrupts the user by enabling vicious tendencies. What it allows me to do is it allows me to practice objectifying real people in my real world. And that will be problematic for me because if I practice objectifying others and I get really good at it, it might make it difficult for me to develop genuine relationships with people, or it might make it difficult for me to develop the skills required to hold to see people as not objects, right? I will really quickly mention there's a standard of the line that I'm taking here for the robust fictionalist is obviously a virtue ethical line. There's a standard objection to virtue ethics that I'll just head off so that we can save some time. The standard objection here would be that the ethical considerations like mine, like how I'm describing the problem with X-ray specs, it locates the wrongness in the wrong place, right? You might think that intuitively, if I have an AR program that allows me to view other people as naked, then it's the wrongness has to do with my relationship to them, that those people are wronged. But what's happening, the virtue ethical account says that it's not those people who are wronged, instead it's me, the user, who is being wronged. It's a pretty standard objection. The reply to that would be, go back to the two defenses that I gave earlier, right? It's just pixels on a screen and nobody's being harmed. Those are really strong claims. If you genuinely buy those 2 points, it's just pixels on a screen and nobody's being harmed, then virtue ethics, it might be a last ditch position, but it might be what's actually needed in these kind of cases. That being said, maybe there are other objections I'm not anticipating, but I talk really fast, so that is all I have to tell you. Thank you very much, and look forward to your comments.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Christopher. Brilliant. So let's kick off the question session with Neil McDonnell.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. Thank you very much. So you didn't say much about which flavour of fictionalism you would be endorsing here, but my preferred flavour, kind of Waltonian style that we apply, Nathan Wildman and I, when we're talking about VR entities, gave me a way of understanding the effigy connection that I wondered what you thought about. Because I mean, saying effigy doesn't quite answer the question yet. Like, it's sort of a new metaphysical question about what one of them is and why we care. But I think what the Waltonian would say here is that certainly in your kind of X-ray specs case, which of course James Bond had in a Pierce Brosnan era variant, real nadir. Anyway, yeah, so it looks like they used the people in question as a prop in a game of make-believe. And, you might very reasonably not like to be used as a prop in certain games of make-believe. And it does seem like something about the person and not to mere pixels. I think that case becomes harder when you're not just looking at a person who's being augmented, but rather that it's a complete, if you like, deepfake where it's been from their likeness represented somewhere else where they're not present. But I still think actually they're the prop in a sense there that it's just been pulled through. And then you can think of there being kind of games where it's the prop, like, oh, pretend that person over there's the bogeyman, and and they never know it's happened. No real harm's done. It's not like it's a really offensive thing to do. But then you might have this kind of local person who people are a bit mean about, and then you treat them like a bogeyman. It does seem like that's maybe got a bit more bite to it. So both, I think you can have innocent cases have been used as a prop, but then objectionable cases have been used as a prop. Not necessarily that you need the technology to be doing part of it, but it appears that would be what was happening in those cases. And then that flavour of fictionalism maybe has an answer to what is an effigy and why does it matter. I wonder what you think about that. It seems to fit with the stuff
I may have missed something. I think you're absolutely right. That there would be morally innocuous uses. There would be morally objectionable uses. The game of tag that I described, Zombie Apocalypse Tag, would be loads of fun, and like that would be an obviously unobjectionable case. If I have a personal AR headset and I want to see the world as a Richard Scarry illustration, I'm not getting consent, right? Nobody's consenting to being used as my Richard Scarry fantasy. Nobody's maybe people don't want to be used in a prop as a prop in a game of make-believe, but like there are different games of make-believe, and there are objectionable ones and there are unobjectionable ones, right? It might be that my using people as a prop in my Richard Scarry, fantasy doesn't bother anybody, but X-ray Specs does. What I missed in your description was how exactly does the Waltonian resolve this? Because it sounds to me like what the Waltonian would do is kind of go towards a deontological analysis. You'd end up having to say that people are being disrespected because I don't want to be used as a prop in a game of make-believe. You're disrespecting my wishes. There's a level of autonomy and so on. Is that what you meant?
I think that can be in there. Yes. I mean, so
Okay.
I mean that would comport with how I think about such cases. But I think viewing them as a prop doesn't settle the moral question, right? Because you can have the variance thereafter. What's wrong about any given case might be something virtue ethicsy, right? Or it might be something deontological. I'm not quite. I think it's better to be non-committal if you're just looking at which fictionalism gets you close to the answer. But I think the Waltonian picture is the bit that gets you. You're using me as a prop in a game. That's the bit that means it's about me and not mere pixels on a screen in front of your eyes. That's the connect. I think that effigy connect, if you like, that reaching out to being about the person, then brings in the scope of moral considerations that can be about a person and not can't be about pixels.
Okay, in that case, maybe it's that the Waltonian fictionalist has to actually go down the deontological route and not the virtue ethical route. Maybe that's in the case of video games where you're playing single player video games, I feel like the robust fictionalist view is kind of like the last ditch position that you have. I don't know that the Waltonian view fits as well, but what we're worried about is X-ray specs. So maybe that's the analysis we'd give.
Yeah, I'll just say I don't think the Waltonian has to be deontological, but they can be once you do this.
Yes,
but they don't have to be. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think I agree. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have Alexander.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Great talk. Good to see you. So I was just wondering about something, which is that, so what would you say about the difference between these single sphere AR systems and your specs example, and a case where I would simply fantasize without being augmented by any kind of device about seeing people naked? I'm wondering if your analysis here is just like saying the same thing in the two cases, or how would you differentiate these two cases?
So is your case like, let's forget about AR and just imagine I go walk around the world and I perfectly oogle people?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. What would we say about that kind of case? I mean, I think in that kind of case, you could take either a deontological or a virtue ethical approach. That the problem with oogling people as you walk around the world is that you're practicing a vicious character trait, right? Or that you're disrespecting those people. I think you could go. Does that sound right to you? That you could use either of these, right?
Yeah, it certainly does. I was just wondering what was the difference between where AR would bring something new in the picture here.
See, I hate to say this, but I'm not sure that it does. I mean, one of the things about the analysis that I gave of the virtue ethical view is that I think that has a general application to loads of different cases. Whether we're talking about video games or AR or VR, or whether we're talking about movies, or whether we're talking about just pervily walking around the world and being, creep about it. I don't know that AR does something extra, except that it makes it more persistent for the viewer. Maybe it makes it easier. Maybe what it does is it offloads. If I walk around the world and I oogle people, like there's an imaginative load on me. What AR does is it offloads my imaginative abilities and it provides that for me. Maybe that's what it, I don't know that that's distinctively morally interesting, right? But it might be that there's little else that it actually adds. We good? Yeah.
Okay. Fiona, you're next.
Thanks. A lot of what you said seemed to me to have really strong resonances with what Descartes said about animals. So Descartes thought that animals weren't conscious creatures. They didn't have souls, unlike human beings who had souls and who were conscious creatures. And so he sort of addressed the question, well, is it all right to sort of go about kicking and torturing animals? And he said, well, if you do that, you're not actually causing any harm to anything, because these animals are mere machines, right? They're not conscious, they're not sentient and so on. But he really strongly recommended against doing it because he thought it would make you a worse person and that you would be more likely to be vicious towards your fellow human beings if you started being vicious towards animals. So is this the same argument? Is this the same set of considerations? Is there something different going on here? Are there some disanalogies that I'm not seeing?
No, I don't think it's that. I do think it is that is the kind of case I'm thinking about. And Kant said sort of the same thing, right? That animals don't have autonomy. You don't have to treat them with respect, but you ought to treat them with respect anyways, because how you treat animals might have a knock-on effect to how you treat people, right? Kant has the same point. I kind of, perhaps wrongly interpret both Kant, and this is going to be apocryphal or heretical to say, but I kind of, in those passages of Kant and Descartes, think that they're appealing to virtue ethical considerations, right? That it's sort of a problem for my character, I think, or maybe it's more utilitarian. Maybe it has a knock-on effect to how I treat people. So no, I do think that it's the same kind of case. What I got started thinking about this in the video games case, because lots of gamers will insist that, and there's lots of empirical evidence to show that how I behave in a video game really doesn't seem to have a knock-on effect to how I treat people in the real world. It doesn't seem that playing violent video games causes me to be a terrible person or to act in any way. So the problem ends up being, well, what if I develop an attitude or a belief that I just am very good at partitioning, right? So that I never act on this belief. In that case, I think of it sort of analogously to the person who has racist beliefs but never acts on them, the person who has racist beliefs but knows to keep those quiet and just partition them off and never expose themselves to the world. It still seems to me like there's something wrong in that case, like that you're morally better off not having racist beliefs. Great that you don't act on them, right? But you'd be morally better off not having those beliefs in the first place. And for that, I don't know that it has to do with utilitarian consequences or deontological, respect for autonomy. I think we're talking about moral character again.
Yeah. So there's going to be then a huge difference if you're just interacting with avatars who don't have a conscious mind behind them, and then whether you're interacting with avatars that do have a conscious mind behind them or something like that.
Yes. And I think, if AR adds something interesting here, it might be that it enables me to treat other people as if they were avatars. Maybe that would be the interesting moral problem to think about.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Karim, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. Good to see you.
Yes, you too.
I was wondering if sort of at the end of your talk, you had those two examples. You had the example with the picture of the grandpa, or you're the picture of your loved one, right? And then you moved on to the example about the suffragette in Red Dead Redemption 2. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like with the picture of the grandpa, my intuitions were set, right? Like, yeah, there's something iffy about this because it's an effigy and it's a real person. And then you move down to the suffragette who isn't a real person, right? And so I'd love to hear more about moving from the representation of a real person to the representation of a non-real person, and why you think that in both cases there's something iffy going on.
For that, I'm going to steal from John Tilson. So he has this point that when you move from the real person to the NPC, to the not real person, that what you are still doing is you're representing a kind of person, and you're representing a person that fits a certain set of beliefs or set of attitudes, or there's some characteristic about them that is distinctive. In the case of the suffragette, it's, she's a profound feminist, right? So if you're thinking of this person as a kind of person, it's the same thing with the video game. What is offensive about the game Jesus Strikes Back, where you play as a Christian nationalist and try to massacre as many non-Christians as you can? I mean, what's creepy about that is that it's not about any one particular actual person, but that it's about targeting kinds of people. And I think, isn't that kind of how effigies can work, right? They can be symbols of kinds of people as well. So you're representing a group rather than a specific individual. So yeah, I'm just going to steal whole from John Tilson on that.
Okay, I'm next in the queue, Christopher. So I had a thought. I was thinking back to that nice chart that Max had in his presentation about the different kinds of agents that might be involved here, and thinking about how some of what you were saying might extend to designers in particular, but maybe the regulatory community more generally. And I was thinking about the sort of your worry that you were falling into the Chris Mills trap of saying, well, look, it all depends upon how somebody is engaging with this. I mean, one of the same action might be a manifestation of disrespect with one set of psychological states and not with another. But I thought if we shift the agent we're thinking about from the user to the designer, let's say, you're not going to necessarily have that problem, because you might think that there's one thing that can manifest disrespect is you having those mental states and engaging with an effigy in that sort of way. And another thing you can do which manifests disrespect is by rendering a person or a population vulnerable to being treated with disrespect by particular individual users. And of course, that latter type of disrespect, which is the thing that happens with designers and regulators, is not something that depends upon any individual mental states. I mean, the person who programmed that particular bit of Red Dead Redemption 2 online might well not have had any negative attitudes towards suffragettes whatsoever, but nevertheless what they did was made a certain kind of person vulnerable to a certain sort of disrespect or maltreatment by people. So if you shift that, and I suppose I have half an eye on our ambitions for the rest of the series, where we're starting to think about these questions of guidelines for designers, regulation for sort of political communities, that when you shift to that kind of level, actually the Chris Mills point drops out, because the agents that we're really targeting there are going to be ones where the psychological dependence you worried about doesn't apply so much.
Yeah, in the case of designers, I think I think one of the things that we have to take into account is like anticipated uses of how users are going to interact with a thing. Designers have, their view of what the product is supposed to be and how somebody is going to interact with it. But I do think that designers have to be a little bit more broad in anticipating the various uses that other people will put to their product. Like, I'm sure when people designed YouTube, they had no idea that beheading videos would be a thing. I'm sure that when they didn't think that revenge porn would be a thing. And yet nonetheless, it often strikes me as, I don't know if I would call it negligence, but how did they not anticipate that? How did they not anticipate that people would use YouTube for really awful purposes? In the case of the suffragette in Red Dead, one of the interesting things to notice about that case is that it was a choice. It was a choice on the part of the, so when you design video game characters, some of them can be attacked and some of them can't be attacked. And that's embedded in the code. Most avatars of children in games can't be attacked. You shoot guns at them all day long and bullets apparently pass through children, which is fantastic. So the choice to make the suffragette attackable was an intentional choice. And think of it this way, with Red Dead Redemption, we often celebrate video games as this medium that provides a whole bunch of freedom, right? It's interesting compared to other kinds of fiction because it provides this freedom for the player to do what they wish. But notice that it's an extremely narrow freedom. In Red Dead Redemption, I can only interact with the world in ways that the game designer has sanctioned, right? I can steal things, I can shoot things, I can ride around. I can't, give up the thug life and go to university. I can't do that in Red Dead Redemption, right? My freedom is restricted. So the game designers gave us the option to harm the suffragette. It's built into the code that she is harmable. That's a choice. That it might be that in that case, how is it possible that they didn't intend it, or that's not an intended use? They intentionally put into the code that she can be attacked. So I like to think of anticipated uses a bit more broadly. Like I think software designers, AR designers need to perhaps need to be a little bit more cynical. Like what kind of cynical uses could my customers put this product to, and that should be part of the decision-making. What am I willing to live with? That will people use the object for this? In Jeff's talk, when we were talking about how it would be great if houses could be marked to show you where a sex offender lives, that's fantastic, sure. But that same technology will also be used to dox people, brutally. I hope that helps.
That does indeed.
I know
Thank
that
you.
there's a queue. So
so the next person on the queue is actually Ding. So you had a question, Ding, you wanted to ask.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Maybe I'm not very clear, but there's a point that I think probably is relevant. Is so my take on let's say crime or immoral things players do in the video game. I don't think there's an innate wrong or wrongness or if it's fine in this behavior itself. What matters is whether the players got appropriate emotional response from, let's say, killing a person in the video game, like an NPC in the video game. So if a player, like maybe the plot was designed in a way that the player just kills someone in the video game, but the player got like fear or like feel very bad about it. And if this is the intention of the game design, I think there's nothing wrong for killing that NPC in the video game. But if the video game is designed in a way that to get players to feel appropriate or pleasure or fun for doing the immoral things, then I think that would be problematic. So I think what really matters is the emotional response to a certain criminal behavior in the video game. Did I make it clear?
Yes, and it's not that you were unclear about this, it's that I was unclear. I didn't say that. I should have said that. You're absolutely right. And I think that's part of the whole, my point about how attitudes are manifested in the way that we play games, and those attitudes have a role to play in how we emotionally respond to the game as well. Think about, so there are in many countries there are rating agencies that have to look at video games and make a judgment about what age rating is appropriate for the game. So there are people that actually have to play these things and come up with a judgment of where the age rating is. So suppose one of the games they have to play is one of these hardcore white supremacist games. I'm not saying that the player is always wrong to do it. I'm saying that in the person who is playing the game to figure out, this is their job, and they've got to figure out what the correct age rating is for this thing. They might be horrified while they're playing this game, and that would be, I would say, an appropriate emotional response. It's the player who plays the game with relish, right? That should creep us out. That should be really odd. The player who plays the game with relish is manifesting an attitude, and their emotional response is predicated on that as well. So I apologize. I should have said that earlier.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very clear. May I ask like a very quick follow-up? So
I think, Ding, if you'll forgive me, I'm aware that
sure.
you have something to do at 5 o'clock. So
thank you very much.
I'm going to sort of call it to a close now, if you don't mind. And apologies to the other people who are in the queue that we didn't quite get to. I think it's a testament to your talk, Christopher, that we were in that position.